So I look outside my room here, looking over Bath, and the leaves are off most of the trees. It's very cold outside by British standards, and we've moved from when we met in September, was it September, end of September, from autumn into winter. And we've moved towards the end of this course. And so this is the final module. And I hope we can see this as a recapitulation. So let me just go through my own sense of the story from my own point of view. When I was a young academic and developing the whole process of participative research, participative worldviews, one of the questions obviously that was around was, well, how do we do it? What do we mean by participative research? But hard on the heels of that came the question, well, what do we mean by good research? We borrowed the term validity. What's valid research? One of the first questions when I came back from America with my bright new PhD was a friend of mine said, but that was a very small n that you worked with. How can you justify that? It's an interesting question. And of course, it's a question that comes directly out of the traditional paradigm which evolves, as we've seen from Descartes and the other lot. And it's a good question. Once you've undercut all the assumptions that traditionally have laid underneath Western science, Western research, what do we mean by good? One of my promotion interviews at the University of Bath, you go through, as you could imagine, a series of steps. And I was interviewed by senior members of the university to be a senior lecturer. And one of them, a scientist and an engineer, said, I've looked at your papers. And you really are a heretic, aren't you? That was the word he used. You're a heretic. And I explained why, from my point of view, my arguments were right, and presumably I got through. It's quite interesting that several years later, when I was by now a professor myself and sitting on with him on the university's ethics committee, he turned around to me and said, I remember asking you or suggesting you were a heretic, and I just realised that you were right and I was wrong. So I was very pleased about that. But it is a radical move to say we're going to do research with people, to see people as co-researchers. All those things are radical moves. So early on, we wrote papers about validity. We talked about validity, and that was fruitful work. But ultimately, the idea of validity itself comes from the orthodox paradigm. And it's a dualistic idea. If you're not valid, you're invalid. It's either or. There's no sort of way of being half valid. It's a splitting kind of idea. And so I began to use the term quality. What do we mean by quality in this kind of research? What do we mean by quality in this kind of thinking? Just go back to the readings again and look at the history here. Montaigne and the Renaissance humanists, Tuleman talks about their humanistic skepticism. The skepticism meaning that they wanted to use their own experience and their own human judgment to make sense of things. They were very suspicious of big overarching ideas. They were interested in attending to their own experience and making sense on that basis. That's Tuleman's story. Descartes, on the other hand, influenced by the religious wars of that time and the political upheaval, was on the search for certainty. And because of the human cost of the religious disputes, he says we can't we can't turn to human judgment, we need to turn to method. So one of the key steps in science from that beginning was to take the sense of quality out of human judgment and put it into method. And therefore, as the medical people, they talk about the gold standard of the experimental, the clinical trial. Of course, other people will say, well, that's not the whole story, because in the end, the judgment lies within the community of scientists, and that also is true. But certainly if you've knocked around with medical people very much, particularly medical people, you will hear this sense of resorting to method. So the participatory worldview places judgments about quality firmly back into the human and the human community, and potentially with the more than human community as well, although that's really at the leading edge of what we can be, or some of us can be thinking about. So that's what my paper that I've asked you to read for this time is all about. Choice and quality. As we worked with people on their PhDs and master's programs at Bath, we realized that different kinds of issues led to different kinds of questions. It's an obvious thing to say. But different kinds of issues led to different kinds of demands from the research, and therefore to different kinds of demands on quality. For some people, for some research people, we really do need to know an answer. We need to know whether the answer is good or not. I was involved at one stage peripherally with a potential action research about using dressings on wounds. And the nurses involved were saying, look, there's a huge amount of clinical research, experimental research about different sorts of dressings, but it's not practical. We don't know how this gets used in practice, and therefore we want to set up an inquiry process where we will explore our professional judgment about which ones of these actually work in the clinic, and taking account the scientific research, but also our own professional judgment. And there, the questions about does it work or not, is it valid or invalid, are actually quite appropriate. But if you go to the other extreme of trying to work with a group of people who have been silenced, oppressed, maybe the best you can do in a doctoral program, maybe the most important aspect of inquiry, is simply to open the space for the dialogue and the conversation. And maybe that is that's as far as you're going to get. And that's not to be overlooked. In other cases, there will be choices. Do we, in the middle of an inquiry, do we go this way, or do we go that way? When I worked with doctors in the theory and practice of holistic medicine, there was a split between the group, between those who believed that the politics of medicine were most important, and the question of how do we re-empower our patients was the key method and the key issue. And another group of people who were much more concerned with mind, body, spirit kinds of questions, and the whole sense of how do we help patients become more self-healing, more interested in using complementary practices and even things like prayer. And that was a clear split. Now, in a sense, we went both ways at the same time because we had enough people to do that, but there were choices. And so at Bath, we began to invite, almost require, but one doesn't ever require anything in the long run, but it was expected, let's put it that way, that there would be a serious discussion within every PhD, a chapter maybe, or a part of a chapter, which explored these questions of quality. and said, these are the choices that I've made. These are the issues that I or my community of inquirers decided were the most important. And this is how we would justify the choices we've made. These are the mistakes we made. These are the places where we would have done it differently if we had it again. So there's a sense of a transparency in what it is where the thesis offers. So the examiner reading it can say, yeah, against these criteria, this has been well done or not well done in my judgment. And I may or may not agree with the criteria, but then we can have a discussion about that in the Viva Voce examination, as we still have in Europe. I'm not sure whether you do in America. So this paper was really a culmination of all that set of thinking. And if you look on my website, there's another one which Judy Marshall and I wrote called Taking an Attitude of Inquiry as a Question of Quality, something like that. I may put the link in for you. And that was one of our students said, you know, the key thing that I realize is that my research is about taking an attitude of inquiry in my life. And that's, again, goes much back to the Renaissance humanist, to Montaigne, than it does to Descartes. So I'd really like you to read this paper, read it critically, see what you think about it. But I'd like you to do it with a sense of being an opening to reviewing this semester, and also looking forward to beginning to ask, and you know, it's a long way before you're really into your research, your dissertations, but beginning to ask questions. Well, then what are the quality issues that I think I need to attend to? Where are the questions? Where's the nub in all this? So I'm interested in this as an opportunity for you both to recap and maybe catch up and reread some of the stuff that, or read for the first time, some of the stuff we looked at earlier. But also to look forward and to say, what sort of choices am I making now, and what are the consequences of that for future work? So you begin to lay the foundations for reflections and discussions on quality. I hope that makes sense.